it's Dave with Taboo Customs. This video today we're going to be talking about and replacing a rear drive shaft U-joint in this 98 TJ here behind me. So let's take a look. So this is a 98 TJ. It still has the stock style rear drive shaft, and the stock style means that we have a slip joint here going into the transfer case. In some cases, if you have a Jeep that's been lifted, the previous owner, you may have gone in and replaced this slip joint here at the back of the transfer case with the slip yoke eliminator kit and put in a standard style drive shaft, which would have the slip in the middle of the drive shaft instead of in the front of it. So anyway, with the stock OEM drive shaft, we just have this rear U-joint that we will have to loosen up. Now, whenever I get under vehicles, I just have a habit of grabbing these and seeing if they're loose, no matter what I'm doing. And this was what happened here today. Is I got under here and I was like, oh, it's not too bad. But then I was like, wait, there is actually a little bit of movement. Now, it's not much. You probably can't even see it on the camera, but there's about, I don't know, maybe a 1/16 of movement. Now, I'm looking for two things. I'm looking for movement in the joint itself, or I'm looking for movement in this yoke actually on the rear axle, because what can happen is this nut can sometimes back off, the bearings inside can wear, etc., etc. But with this Jeep here, we do have movement in our U-joint. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull this drive shaft off and replace that U-joint. So to remove the drive shaft, it's pretty simple. Now, this is a stock yoke. There's two different styles of yokes you will typically see. Stock yokes are typically strap style yokes. So we have a strap and a couple of bolts on each side that hold this U-joint into the yoke. That is typically considered a weaker design than, let's say, a U-bolt yoke, where a U-bolt will actually slide all the way through and you'll have nuts on the back. Those are typically stronger. If you do a lot of off-roading or wheeling, I would potentially recommend that you look at swapping from a strap style to a U-bolt style, because they are a lot more reliable, especially with off-roading, and typically that's something that we will do in all of our vehicles that we wheel. So anyway, getting to removing this, one thing you'll have to be careful of, and this one has a little bit, is if you do have a Jeep you have been off-roading, you can damage these bolts pretty easily. They'll be rounded off, so you may have issues with that. The other thing is you may have typically two different types of bolts here. You might have a 6-point bolt, or you might have a 12-point bolt if someone has potentially swapped it out with different bolts. But typically standard in a stock TJ, these will be 6-point. Now, we recommend using a 6-point socket and not using a 12-point socket, because with the damage here, there is a high potential to sometimes round these off. And if you do round them off, you're going to end up having to probably go in here and cut the head of that off. Now, when you do that, you're typically just going to cut the head of that off and not worry about the strap, cut into the strap and replace the strap. That is a lot safer than trying not to cut the strap and then eventually, potentially getting into this drive shaft. You don't want to do that, so just go cut off the strap as well. Don't worry about it. Go to the parts store, buy some new straps. So we're just using a 3/8 drive with an 8mm socket, 6-point, and I might have needed to go and grab a big screwdriver, because all right, so with the big screwdriver, we're going to put it in the middle to hold it from spinning. And this is one that has some damage to it, but not too much. What we're actually going to do is get a small hammer, drive the socket down onto it to make sure it seats. All right, so with our straps out now, we'll use our screwdriver for a little leverage. We'll pry it out. Make sure you hold both caps on. It doesn't really matter if it's a bad drive shaft, but you don't necessarily need a mess. And it could be a little bit of a pain getting enough clearance. And if we were reusing that U-joint, that would have been a bad thing, but since we're not gonna worry about it. Now, the drive shaft, if you still have a decent boot, well, there will be a band that you'll have to kind of force off. With the drive shaft off, there's a couple of things on the yoke here that you can look for. One, take it and try to move it, see if the yoke can move up and down. Obviously it's gonna, spin, but if it can move up and down, then it could be loose, or just might just need tightened up. Might be that the bearings in here are worn out, need to go in and replace pinion bearings, which would be a much deeper process. Another thing to look for is look at these tabs here on the edges of the yoke that hold the U-joint in. Look and see if those have broken off. Sometimes they will break off, and then you're going to have trouble keeping caps to stay inside of that yoke. You can also look at your seal, your pinion seal, which ours isn't looking too great, but you can look and see if it's leaking, and now would be the time to go ahead, pull the yoke off and replace it if it was leaking pretty bad. So let's take a look at the drive shaft and the U-joint that we're going to replace. All right, so there's a lot of ways to get your U-joint out. I'm going to show you what I use, and I've used a lot of different ways, and I'll kind of mention them as we go through it. First thing you're going to need to do is, with these U-joints here in this rear drive shaft, you're going to have a clip in the end, and you'll need to take a pair of needle nose and grab onto that clip. Sometimes it'll get stuck in there, so it'll look like that. Sometimes it'll get stuck in there. You might have to work it back and forth. You might need to get a flat screwdriver and pry it out. Sometimes the one side will break, and you'll have to get a pick in there and get underneath it and try to pry it out. It can be a real pain if you have to do that. But we'll basically do both sides here. You see, like this one here is a little bit more not coming out as well. Oh, it just worked it loose. I said it could have got a flat screwdriver, pulled it so loose, pulled it on one side and popped it out. You do have to be careful of that though, because it can pop straight up at your face and hit you in the eyes, which doesn't feel good. I can't tell by moving this U-joint itself that it's, in some sections it's really loose, some sections it's really tight. It's just one of those indicators that it's pretty worn. I do know that this Jeep sat for quite a while with a blown engine, so chances are it just started to perhaps get a little rust in there or whatnot. You're looking at the inside of the bearing caps, it looks pretty old. So what we're going to do to get this U-joint out is I've got a impact socket here, and this socket is a 3/4 inch socket, and it's just barely smaller than the caps that are inside the cups here. So we're going to take this, we're actually going to put it on top of a heavy plate. We're going to set our cap in there. Oh, and then we're going to apparently hit our camera. We're going to take our hammer, we're going to hit, we're not going to hit up here where the cap is, we're going to hit just behind it. And hopefully it'll pop out like that. Sometimes you will have to take a pair of vice grips and grab it, kind of twist it, pop it off. Now, sometimes these will pop off pretty easy. Drop our socket. Some drive shafts, this one doesn't have it, will have enough space where you can pull the rest of the way out for this one, but this won't, so we're gonna have to do the opposite and go the other way. With that, I'm gonna have to flip the socket over. The one thing to be careful is make sure that potentially this cup could have gone down farther and is now out of alignment with the hole. You don't want that. You don't want to bust the drive shaft. All right, so I cleaned up the old U-joint, and I can look and see, and I don't know if you'll be able to see it in the video, but right in there you can see how it's all galled up on that surface, and it's probably hard to see, but there's some chatter in there, which is basically that this round surface now is a surface like that, just from the wear of the needle bearings in there. Go ahead and we'll clean up these surfaces a little bit. Would also recommend taking a pick, and we'll go get one here in a second, cleaning out this groove, because that groove will be important, because that does hold your caps in when you get your new U-joint in there. I know I said I would mention other ways to remove this U-joint if you don't want to basically take a hammer to your drive shaft. There are a couple other ways. Now, another way, and this is with a hammer, that we have done it is if you don't want to potentially use a socket and push on the caps, we have actually got some V's that we have cut that we can set this down into like this, and then actually hammer on it to push the cap up, and we actually push on these V's, but obviously you don't want to do that if you've got a U-joint you're going to reuse. Another method is to have a large C-clamp, a couple of different size sockets, a socket that basically has enough clearance for the cup to fit down into from the U-joint, but is small enough to sit on here so that you can push that cap into that socket with the large C-clamp. You can do it that way, or if you have a press, you can obviously take it to a press, and with our larger drive shafts, we typically will take it over to the press because they're a lot harder to get out. But with these 1310s, the small U-joints, you can see they come out pretty easily. But definitely, if you are using this method, be careful not to hit up here in this area, because you don't want to damage especially that groove in there. So now let's take a look at the new U-joint that we're going to be using. All right, so the U-joint that we purchased is a Moog U-joint. It's a 369, and we'll put a link to that U-joint in the description of the video. It is a greasable U-joint. We do recommend using a greasable U-joint and servicing it regularly, and it'll keep it from having some of those galling issues. But you know, this actually had a greasable fitting on there, but I can tell you right now, looking at the inside of it, I don't think it was probably ever greased. So what we're gonna do is we will start and pulling one of these caps off, make sure there's enough grease in there to hold all of the needle bearings in place. That's going to be the most important part of this process, is making sure one of those needle bearings doesn't pop out and turn sideways or go off on the floor. You're going to be searching for it, and then you got to clean it up, and chances are it won't be in good shape whenever you get it done. So what we're going to do is we'll pull a couple of these off, one off of each side. Then we are actually going to go ahead and seat one a little bit in that bottom. Then we are going to take the U-joint, slide it into the top, and then down into that bottom. And the reason we're putting the U-joint in here and to press on it farther is that we want to make sure that none of those needle bearings kick out. So with the U-joint in there, that will force those needle bearings to basically stay in position. And we can get it down to where the cap is flush with the base. Now what we can do is we can take this top cap, put it down in there, and you can pull the U-joint up and go ahead, slightly tap it down into there. And now what you should be able to do is hold the U-joint in between the two, about in the middle. That way it's actually inside both of the caps, and it's keeping all of those needle bearings in place, making sure that one doesn't kick sideways and get in there and cause an extra space that will cause, one, it'll cause the clips to be difficult to put in, or if you really get after it, you can crush it. And I know that from experience. In the past, I have crushed one. So now with the top bearing, or excuse me, top cap flat, you can basically let this sit down now, because it's going to be able to be in both caps. And we'll go ahead and drive it in farther using our socket. We want to drive it just below the level of our groove. We will take one of our clips, make sure your clip is seated all the way around. Now we can flip it over and do the same thing from the other side. Now with it down, if you can see a gap between the piece of rubber here, the seal for the cap and the U-joint, you may have a 1/16 gap in there. That would be an indication that one of those needle bearings perhaps is sitting in the bottom of that cap, and you're not able to seat this U-joint all the way. All right, so there we have both of the clips now seated. I'm actually going to knock it back just a little bit. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and we will install our grease zerk, and then we will reinstall the drive shaft back in the Jeep before we go and grease our U-joint again. Now it's going to potentially depend on the U-joint you're getting, but this is taking an 8mm nut driver to install. All right, so back to the TJ. So time to reinstall. Now, one thing to make sure your caps don't fall off. You don't want those to go anywhere, so keep a hold of those. Now the splines in this 98 TJ are not, there is not a master spline in it, so it is not keyed in any direction. So you can put it back onto the transfer case slip joint pretty much in any orientation. And then we'll just have to push it enough to get everything up and over. Now that's easiest to start from the, this side of the yoke and work your way in. You can basically step one side of the U-joint over and then pivot this other side over. Now, the next step is putting our caps back on. Now, one of the things I should have mentioned also before is one thing to check for is make sure that your caps haven't stretched. These caps can stretch, and then they will not hold the U-joint down tight. Now ours, and you can also check that by putting it on top of the cap and making sure there's some play. So ours will rock back and forth, so we know that whenever we tighten these down, it's going to snug that cap down. Now, for the bolts, we do go and put a little bit of Loctite on the bolts. Some people do, some people don't. The reason that we do is that we aren't really worried if these do break off in here. I'd rather just swap out a yoke, and we have tons of yokes. These yokes are pretty easy to get. Honestly, we'd probably swap it to a U-bolt yoke anyway if they broke off in there, which would be an upgrade. So we're not so worried about that. Now, these bolts are a problem, however, and that is that they do not take very much to actually break these bolts off. A lot of people will break them off when they're tightening them down. The specs out there, if you look around, you'll find anywhere from 14 to about 18 foot-pounds on these. A lot of people, what they'll do is they will use a 1/4-inch drive ratchet and basically make them as tight as they can get them with a 1/4-inch drive ratchet, or you can obviously torque them. We'll use this 3/8 ratchet, and I've done so many of these that, and I've broken off a lot of them in the past. Well, I guess I shouldn't say a lot, but a few of them. So I know how far how far it goes before it breaks. But they definitely can cause an issue. All right, so that will do it for the installation of this new rear drive shaft U-joint, this 98 TJ. The last thing for us to do is go in there and grease that. Now, if you are going to go and grease that, you may need a pretty narrow grease gun nozzle to get down in there and attach to that. But it's pretty important that you do get in there and grease them. They will last a whole lot longer if you are regularly doing your maintenance on them. So thank you for watching. If you have any questions, you can leave a comment on this video, or you can contact us on our website, taboocustoms.com, where you can also find rust repair kits, skid plates, and a lot of other items for Jeeps and some other vehicles out there. So thanks for watching, and as always, a like or subscribe is greatly appreciated.